Hello class, we're going to review the second morning in Perry's dialogue on good, evil, and the existence of God. Here are some study guide questions to help us get started. 1. Which modal distinction does Cohen introduce to address the puzzle of theological fatalism? 2. How might a fatalist respond to Cohen's modal distinction? 3. How does Weirob argue that free will is incompatible with God's justice, and how does Miller respond? 4. Which puzzle about identity does Weirob raise about the afterlife? 5. Which puzzle arises concerning the topic of eternal rewards and punishments? 6. Why does Weirob mention the baby bat? And 7. Why are natural evils a problem for Miller's theodicy? Okay, as always, when I answer these study guide questions, you might want to take some notes, write it down, type it up, crochet it into a sweater, or however it is that you best remember the information. When we last left off, Weirob, Cohen, and Miller were wondering how it is possible for us to have free will on one hand, but on the other hand for God to know everything, including our future actions. It's at this point that Cohen introduces a certain kind of distinction. First, on the topic of God's power, God is all-powerful, and what all-powerful means is that God can do anything. It doesn't mean that God does everything, just that he can. For example, if God is all-powerful, that means that God can lift every stone. It doesn't mean that God does lift every stone, just that God can lift every stone. Likewise, God's omnipotence means that he can fight any animal and win, but not that he does fight every animal and win, and so on. The idea is that there's a distinction between what someone can do and what they actually do. It's a can-do distinction. Now, appealing to that distinction, Cohen proposes the following. When we say that God knows everything, it doesn't mean that God is actually aware of the total sum of facts about every single thing, like God is aware of everything that you could possibly be aware of. No. When we say that God knows everything, says Cohen, it just means that there's nothing that he cannot look up, so to speak. There's nothing that God can't Google. God's omnipotence, in other words, consists in his ability to be aware of any information, not in his actual awareness of that information. That's Cohen's proposal. Furthermore, building on the can-do distinction, Cohen suggests the following. What if God could be aware of your future choices, but chooses not to be aware of your future choices? What if God, in other words, deliberately limits his own knowledge of the future in order to guarantee that you have free will? And here we have the analogy of knowing that one of your friends is driving from point A to point B, and being able to look up the exact route that they take from point A to point B, but choosing not to look up that route because you don't want to actually know or be aware of the specific route that they're taking. So there we have Cohen's proposal. Maybe God limits his own knowledge of what you're going to do in order to give you some room to act freely. Does that response work? Well, let's consider how a fatalist would respond. The problem with Cohen's account is this. Just because God chooses not to know a certain fact doesn't mean that there isn't already that fact. Indeed, as long as it's possible for God to know what you will do, as long as there is a fact which God could be aware of, in other words, that is enough to make it fixed and settled what it is that you're going to do. That's the problem with Cohen's response, in other words, is that as long as God could know, this itself is a threat to your free will. For if God could know, that means there is a fact of which God could be aware. And as long as there is a fact about what you will do, well, then it's already settled what you will do. You're not free. Or that's how I think the fatalist should respond to Cohen. Now, it's at this point that Weirob observes something, that if God really gives free will to everyone, and if this really means that people can do evil, then this may give us a reason to wonder about whether God is really just. After all, if I took a bunch of people and isolated them in an environment and then ignored all the horrible things that they might do to each other, is that fair of me? So does Weirob ask whether it is fair of God to just leave a bunch of people in the world knowing that there's freedom to do evil. Miller's response to this worry, of course, characteristically Christian, is to say that there is an afterlife in which God uses eternal punishments and rewards to balance things out. God does not just leave people in a world to do evil. Oh no, says Miller. God allows them the freedom to choose evil, but if they choose that, then they get punishment. This is Miller's explanation of how God can give people the freedom to do evil and also not intervene, but still be fair. Now, there are a lot of puzzles and questions and objections we could raise about the idea of an afterlife, and we will discuss them in future videos. Weirob raises some puzzles about identity concerning the afterlife. She presses this question. Suppose there is some parallel dimension full of hellfire and punishment for the sinful, and suppose that a soul somehow appears there shortly after Weirob's death. Even in that case, how could Weirob be sure that that soul was her? What type of creature must Weirob be, in other words, in order to not only live a life of a human being, but also somehow end up in a parallel punishment dimension without a body at all? This is a puzzle about identity which Weirob raises for the afterlife. And it's a puzzle which John Perry wrote a whole other dialogue about, his dialogue on personal identity and immortality, which I've already covered on this channel. Again, link in the doobly-doo. But for now, let's just note one basic puzzle. In Christian theology, heaven and hell are everlasting. They are infinite. They go on forever. This raises a puzzle. How is it fair to give an infinite punishment for a finite crime? And conversely, I suppose, how is it fair to give someone an infinite reward for a finitely good life? There seems to be some disproportion in the rewards and the punishments, and where there is disproportion, there is injustice. This is a puzzle raised for not just Christianity, but any religion which has either eternal reward or punishment based on what you did in your finite life. Anyway, it's at this point in the dialogue that Weirob pulls out an old magazine and talks about the fate of a particular baby bat far away in a cave and what happens when its grip on the cave ceiling slips and it falls into a pile of guano. Weirob mentions this case because the baby bat gets eaten by horrible carnivorous cockroaches. It's only a baby, and it didn't do anything wrong. The painful death of the baby bat, it seems, is a little bit of evil. But now let us ask. Did anyone freely choose to push the baby bat down? No. In fact, it seems that the fate of the baby bat is evil, but it's not the result of anyone's free will. It is, in other words, a natural evil. When philosophers talk of natural evils, what they mean are occurrences in the world which are morally wrong or morally bad, and yet which are not intended by anyone. Natural evils are bad things that just happen. Earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, diseases, and little baby bats losing their grip and falling into guano. Weirob brings up the baby bat because it is a natural evil and therefore a problem for Miller's theodicy. Remember, Miller's theodicy says that evil exists because we have free will. Such a claim would entail that wherever you have evil, you have someone who intentionally caused it. But the baby bat shows this is not so. The baby bat's fate is evil, but nobody intentionally caused it. Therefore, it's a counterexample to Miller's theodicy, and something that he has reason to worry about. So, how does Miller respond to the baby bat? How does Miller respond to natural evils? The answer is interesting. We're going to explore it in the next lecture. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching this lecture on the second morning, and I'll see you in the next one.